Good morning, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I am Tim Huxley, Executive Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies here in Singapore. It's my great pleasure this afternoon to welcome you to the third IISS-Fullerton lecture. Following the earlier lectures in the series delivered by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and secondly by British Foreign Secretary William Hague, I'm extremely happy this afternoon to introduce Karl Eikenberry, who was the United States ambassador to Afghanistan from April 2009 until July 2011. He is currently the Payne Distinguished Lecturer at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. I should add that he is also a member of the Board of Trustees of the International Institute for Strategic Studies and has been a good friend to the Institute for many years. Before his appointment as ambassador in Kabul, Ambassador Eikenberry was for 35 years an officer in the United States Army, retiring after a very distinguished career with the rank of Lieutenant General. His postings included 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan. He was commander of the US-led coalition forces there from 2005 to 2007. Ambassador Eikenberry also served in various political military positions, including that of Deputy Chairman of the NATO Military Committee. In addition, Ambassador Eikenberry is a distinguished East Asia specialist. He has an MA in East Asian Studies from Harvard, as well as his MA in Political Science and PhD from Stanford. He studied Chinese in Hong Kong when it was still a British colony, and has an interpreter's certificate in Mandarin Chinese. He's also studied at Nanjing University, earning an advanced degree there in Chinese history. He served as defense attaché in Beijing and as Director for Strategic Planning and Policy at US Pacific Command in Hawaii. He's published numerous articles on Chinese military history and Asia-Pacific security issues, among other topics. So I think it's fair to say that Ambassador Eikenberry could have spoken to us this afternoon with great authority about Asia-Pacific security matters, but as it happens, we agreed that he should speak about the future of Afghanistan and about US strategy in Central and South Asia. This is a crucially important topic in light of the drawdown in US and other NATO forces in Afghanistan, and in terms of what some see as a new great game being played out by the major powers in Afghanistan's region. It's also a topic that we do not hear about enough in this part of the world, in Singapore and Southeast Asia. Future developments in Southeast Asia will, like it or not, make an impact here as they have done in the past. No one could be better qualified or better suited to talk about Afghanistan and its ramifications than Ambassador Karl Eikenberry. Ambassador, we look forward to your Fullerton lecture with huge interest and great anticipation. The floor is yours.
Well, Tim, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. It truly is an honor to be invited to participate in the International Institute for Strategic Studies Fullerton Lecture Series here in Singapore. Thank all of you who have braved the warm weather here to come and participate. I was last in Singapore in 2005. And at that time, I was a Major General of the United States Army, serving in the United States Pacific Command as the Director for Strategic Plans and Policy. And I was in Singapore as we were trying to get to the final stages of, final stages of concluding what became then the very historic US Singapore Strategic Framework Agreement. So some 7 years since I've been to Singapore, and I have to tell you, in the drive from the airport and in walking around this marvelous city-state this weekend, just extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary how Singapore continues to adapt, to innovate, to compete, and to thrive in the world. It remains a real inspiration to so many countries around the globe right now as they struggle with trying to find policy answers to some of the big questions of economy, of development, and governance. Today, as Tim said, I wanted to talk to you about the future of Afghanistan and U.S. strategy in the Central and South Asia region. I'm going to keep my remarks at Tim's request to under 30 minutes, and that will give us plenty of time then for a discussion afterwards and for questions, I know, hoping to finish up here at 1 p.m. So I'll first discuss the challenges that are facing the Afghan government and people and the international community together as we attempt to implement what we call a very ambitious transition plan. Then after that, I'd like to speculate a bit upon how America might pursue its own long-term foreign policy interest in the surrounding Central and South Asia region after it concludes its combat mission in Afghanistan. So let's start then with Afghanistan. As Tim had indicated, I served in Afghanistan twice as a soldier and once as a diplomat for 5 of the last 10 years of my life. I was in the Pentagon when the Al-Qaeda commandeered American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon. I was very fortunate to leave the Pentagon that day alive. I never dreamed that then so much of my life thereafter would be committed to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the region, but here I am. In spite of all this time that I've lived in Afghanistan and the region, though, I would be the first to say I am not an expert at all on what is an extraordinarily complex part of the world. I'm reminded of a story that goes back to the fall of 2002, shortly after I'd arrived in Kabul on what was my first tour of duty in Afghanistan. And of course, getting on the ground in Afghanistan, knowing very, very little about that country and about the people, the first thing that I set out to do was to go out and meet with as many Afghan leaders and citizens as I could to learn about their traditions, their custom, and their history. One evening, shortly after I arrived in Kabul, I was at the Khyber restaurant in Kabul, and I was hosting for dinner a Brigadier General Asifi. At that time, General Asifi was the commander of the Afghan border police. I was working with an interpreter, an Afghan interpreter. We were having to use Dari to communicate, Dari English to communicate. And this interpreter I had was a very good young man. He was about 98% on accuracy, but he was 110% when it came to catching the emotion and the spirit of what my interlocutors were trying to convey. And of course, that's a pretty good trade. I wasn't there trying to negotiate nuclear non-proliferation agreements. So at this dinner then with Brigadier General Asifi, General Asifi became more and more animated in the course of the dinner as I was genuinely asking him questions. What about your culture? Tell me about your traditions. And he got more and more excited. And accordingly, my interpreter got more and more excited. And as my interpreter got more and more excited, the accuracy level came down a bit, but that was okay. So General Asifi then reached what I knew was the culminating point of what he was trying to convey to me. And my interpreter, now very excited, translating back into English, he said, General Asifi just said that we Afghans have a long history of inviting foreigners to our country and then hospitalizing them. Now, I think in this instance, my interpreter did get it wrong. I think what he meant to say is, we Afghans have a long history of inviting foreigners to our country and then showing them great hospitality. But the fact is that now some 10 years later that I'm not absolutely sure does prove that I'm not an expert on this region. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about Afghanistan then. Soon after his inauguration as the United States president in January of 2009, President Barack Obama directed that there be a very comprehensive review conducted of our war in Afghanistan and the strategy that we were following. This review, which was exhaustive in scope and very exhaustive and comprehensive in terms of detail, did make clear that the Taliban, which was enjoying sanctuary, as it does today, in Pakistan, had achieved political and military momentum in Afghanistan. And it was also evident through this review that the lack of international attention and inadequate resources had led and contributed to this deterioration in the situation. From a United States perspective, as the then U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, now retired Admiral Mike Mullen, said in the year 2000, in Iraq, we do what we must. In Afghanistan, we do what we can. And that's the situation that President Obama inherited. So, in late 2009 then, upon the conclusion of the review, President Obama ordered a surge into Afghanistan of U.S. military forces and civilians with the purpose of, first, denying al-Qaeda safe haven, number two, to reverse the Taliban's momentum and deny it the ability to overthrow the Afghan government, and three, importantly, to strengthen the capacity of the Afghan National Security Forces, the Army and Police of Afghanistan, and the government, so they could take then the lead responsibility for Afghanistan's future. Within 1 year, in November of 2010, agreement then had been reached between President Hamid Karzai and the NATO International Security Assistance Force, referred to as NATO ISAF, the heads of state of government, at the NATO Lisbon Summit to initiate what we called then a structured, partnered transition process by which the government of Afghanistan would assume full responsibility for securing its country by the end of 2014. This plan was also sanctioned by the United Nations. Implementation then began last summer, and at this point, some 75% of Afghanistan's population lives in areas that are either fully under the control of their own army or police, or they're living in areas where there's an agreed upon transition plan which will achieve that end state that's underway. Transition in Afghanistan does not mean the withdrawal or the abandonment by the international community, certainly the United States of America, from Afghanistan. It represents a change in the roles and the responsibilities of the international community and the international military forces from one of what we could say is direct action and intervention to one of support. Indeed, as President Obama said at the NATO summit just last month in Chicago, as Afghanistan stands up, it will not stand alone. Now, the U.S. posture and presence in Afghanistan after the completion of this transition process are not yet decided in specifics, but with the recent signing of the U.S.-Afghan Strategic Partnership Agreement, joint planning, which is inclusive of NATO ISAF, is underway. Regarding international military forces in Afghanistan, I'd anticipate that after the year 2014, contingent upon agreement with the government of Afghanistan and ratification and approval by their parliament, the deployments of NATO security assistance mission in Afghanistan dedicated to the further training of the Afghan army and police will be extant, and that there'll be likely a U.S.-led counterterrorist force. Both of these forces, then, or both of these missions, a security assistance mission by NATO, with a large part of that being U.S., and then a U.S.-led counterterrorist force, both of those missions in turn being enabled by U.S. military infrastructure and supporting elements. Now, achieving these very ambitious targets that have been set for transition in Afghanistan are going to be daunting and challenging. Let me detail now for you what I would say are four major obstacles to success. First of all, to be frank, Pakistan. Its apparent unwillingness and perhaps in some instances inability to deal with Afghan Taliban sanctuaries inside of Pakistan make transition higher risk. In the absence of Pakistani cooperation, U.S. coalition and Afghan cost in terms of casualties and treasure will increase. Second, risk related to the Afghan National Security Force training and equipping programs. There are several, and these include very high sustainment cost for the Army and Police of Afghanistan, estimated by the year 2014 to be annually over $4.5 billion US dollars per year. The difficulties that the Afghans themselves will have in maintaining a very large and complex Army and police organization, the political reliability of the Afghan forces leadership, and fourth and finally, the potential, I would say, for Afghanistan, or the risk of Afghanistan becoming what you might call a national security state, given the huge amount of resources that the Afghan National Security Forces consume today relative to other agencies of the Afghan government, and indeed relative to the private sector. This is a risk that has to be considered and addressed. To illustrate, first of all, the Afghan National Security Forces number today some 346,000, and there's an agreed end state objective that's been established by November of this year to take that number up to 352,000. Of this number, 195,000 of this end state number, 195,000 will be Afghan National Army. By comparison, in 1985, during the Soviet occupation, the Afghan National Army at that time was about 90,000 in strength. So we're talking about an end state of 195,000 to be maintained. We're talking then at the height of the Soviet occupation, an ANA that was not over 90,000 strong. Now, the size of these forces will be reduced, there's hope, after the year 2014, that being security conditions permitting. This would help to, of course, lower the overall fiscal cost, but this also begs the question, if there is a reduction in the number of Army and police in Afghanistan in the year 2014, how can this be conducted seamlessly when Afghanistan currently faces huge problems of unemployment and underemployment? A third set of obstacles, and these pertain to the uncertain consequences of the economic downturn that Afghanistan will experience when foreign spending levels decline over the next several years. Currently, the Afghan government is generating revenues of about $2 billion US dollars per year, while foreign spending in Afghanistan annually is at a level of about $10 billion per year. So the Afghan economy is artificially propped up right now, and it's massively distorted by unsustainable levels of foreign spending and cash injections into the Afghan economy. We really don't know what the second and third order economic, political, and indeed security effects of a recession will be as economic problems become more pronounced as we proceed with transition. Now, to be sure, on the economic front, there are some mitigating factors. Afghans' urban areas are more secure and are more vibrant at any time in recent decades, and they really do serve as very good foundations for the further development of commerce in the country. Internal transportation costs in the main have dropped significantly in Afghanistan with the development of road networks and actually with air transport. The skill level of the Afghan workforce has increased significantly since 2001, and external labor migration opportunities in Iran, the Gulf, and India can help to increase overseas remittances, and they may help to dampen recessionary effects. Still, though, the problems that we're facing on the economic front are daunting. The fourth and final challenge and obstacle pertains to the resilience and to the staying power of the central government and the political institutions that underpin them and serve as the basis for the Afghan government's legitimacy. First and foremost, there are problems of massive and rampant corruption. Moreover, Afghan elites are not willing to fully commit to institutions that are heavily supported and subsidized by the international community, whose own staying power they increasingly discount. And importantly, there's another Afghan election, a presidential election, looming in 2014, with many of the preconditions that I would say are needed for success, such as the establishment of national political parties or movements, and the initiation of electoral reform at this point being glaringly absent. Indeed, President Karzai has openly discussed moving the election from 2014 to 2013, and this would make even more urgent then to undertake these necessary enabling reforms. So against this formidable array of challenges, there are some important positives, and let me note four quickly. First, over the past decade, there really has been a very impressive socio-economic and political foundation that's been established in Afghanistan, including especially and importantly in the domains of education, in health, in security, and governing institutions. The accomplishments are very fragile at this juncture, but remembering the very low baseline of late 2001, which is the point that we measure progress from, I have to say that the results that have been achieved in Afghanistan in certain areas are absolutely extraordinary. Second, and importantly, there's no evident winning Afghan political coalition of separatists. Indeed, there's no state in the region that acts and pulls centrifugally against Afghan politics. Third, Afghan memories are still fresh with the memories of the horror of the Soviet occupation, civil war, and Taliban misrule. The elite, in the main, remains committed to making the new Afghanistan work. And fourth and finally, in spite of worries about transition, the Afghan people believe that while international support in the coming years will be less robust than it has been, and it is at present, that it will still be substantial, and that gives them a degree of confidence. Therefore, while we can anticipate setbacks and reversals in the coming years, there are reasons still to be hopeful about Afghanistan's future. Let me now speculate on how the United States might pursue its own long-term interest in the surrounding Central and South Asian regions as it ends its combat missions in Afghanistan. To begin with, what are those interests? We can identify four enduring foreign policy goals. First, maintaining U.S. and partner nation capabilities to continue efforts to dismantle and defeat al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations with transnational aspirations and reach. Great progress has been made in recent years, punctuated by the death of Osama bin Laden a little over a year ago now, but the threat has still not been eliminated. Second, ensuring that Iran abandons its nuclear weapons program. Third, contributing to the maintenance of peace in the region, especially in the South Asia region, given the huge stakes there. And fourth, facilitating growth of regional economies and the development of natural resources, especially through the expansion of multinational or multilateral and international trade agreements and protocols. Now, in pursuing these regional policy goals, several factors, I believe, will decisively shape U.S. ways and means. Most obviously, the major reduction of United States and NATO forces in Afghanistan, which peaked at some 130,000 last year, will have significant consequences. As I've noted, we can anticipate US and NATO military missions in Afghanistan after the year 2014, including US counterterrorist forces, but overall numbers will be drastically reduced. This will mean, on the one hand, less capability, but on the other hand, perhaps a lessening of concern about American intentions by regional actors and by relevant powers. At the same time, I think that regional actors and players will be under more pressure to cooperate and commit more of their own resources to fight transnational terrorism and drug trafficking organizations. Moreover, the downsizing of the transition of the U.S. mission in Afghanistan complements the new U.S. defense strategy that was announced by President Obama at the Pentagon in January of this year. Some of the relevant aspects of this new defense strategy as they apply to Central and South Asia: the prioritization of East Asia and the Asia-Pacific region, as well as the Middle East in the new defense strategy. Secondly, an assumption that the United States will likely not commit large numbers of ground troops to an extended land campaign in the foreseeable future. And third, that counterterrorist operations will be conducted by primarily U.S. Special Operations Forces, with a premium placed on developing of partner capabilities. Additionally, economic constraints will almost certainly impact U.S. foreign policy ways and means of Central and South Asia. Indeed, the U.S. defense strategy that I just referred to lists as its top goal the restoration of America's economic health and its competitiveness. Fiscal pressure will mean less appetite in the United States Congress for U.S. military expenditures and for development assistance programs. So perhaps with fewer means available, this will lead one then to recall Winston Churchill's very famous quote, "Gentlemen, we've run out of money, now we have to think." And that's what our defense strategy is about right now, a lot of thinking. At the same time, U.S. future demand for energy will likely help define American interest in the region, especially in South Asia. Especially in Central Asia. As you're aware, Central Asian states account for about 2.4% of the global oil reserves, and more importantly, about 4.2% of global natural gas reserves. But growing confidence now in the economic potential of U.S. shale oil and gas and other Western Hemisphere energy resources may lessen or may attenuate America's quest for Central Asian energy resources. So, given U.S. enduring interests, then informed by available ways and means, I'd expect that in the coming years we will see a rebalancing of what has been a very Afghan-Pakistan-focused Central and South Asia regional strategy to one that better considers, in a balanced way, the entire region. This trend will, of course, be complemented by parallel steps, I would imagine, by Afghanistan and Pakistan to diversify their own security partnerships. The reduction of the number of U.S. military forces in Afghanistan, the region, will make America's role as the sole guarantor of Afghanistan's security diminish over time. On the one hand, this may provide opportunities for security cooperation between the United States and other major powers with regional equities, but it will also likely lead to more direct competition between those other regional states and other major powers with equities in the region. The U.S. may serve as a balancer, but it will have fewer resources to commit. The U.S. will stay expressly committed to fighting international terrorism, providing security assistance to Afghanistan, and furthering its strategic partnership with India. It will also seek to foster within the region a more cooperative and a collaborative environment for resource development, trade, and investment. A good example of this is the new Silk Road initiative launched by United States Secretary of State Hillary Clinton last year. So in sum, we know that the security and politics of Central and South Asia will remain in some ways problematic in coming years. We can also anticipate that the region will have to find a new equilibrium that's going to be less contingent upon a huge U.S. military and diplomatic presence. But at the same time, the considerable economic potential of the region and significant overlapping common security concerns among the major interested powers does open possibilities for far-sighted diplomats, security strategists, and businessmen to focus on positive versus zero-sum approaches. Let me close then on a very personal note by telling our Singaporean friends here in this audience that you should be extremely proud, as I know that you are, of those deployed members of the Singaporean Armed Forces whom I saw in action both as a soldier and as a diplomat while serving in Afghanistan. As you know, you currently have a medical team and an imagery analysis team stationed with multinational base Tarankot, or at multinational base Tarankot in Uruzgan province in central Afghanistan, and a detachment of trainers at the Afghan Army's artillery school at the Kabul Military Training Center in Kabul. Your soldiers, in my mind, are among the very best within the NATO ISAF coalition. Your nation's being well served by them, and their contribution is greatly appreciated. Let me open the floor now for your questions. Thank you very much.
Great, Karl. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you for providing us with such an authoritative and at the same time, I think, very frank assessment of the prospects for security and stability in Afghanistan. And you spoke about the obstacles facing security and stability there in the future. And also for placing the future of US policy towards that country in a broader regional perspective, which I think is very helpful. Your assessment was characterized by balance and realism, but I think also by, I think it's fair to say, by cautious optimism. I'm sure that there will be a wide variety of questions from the audience, and soon I'll invite the first of those questions. Could I ask, please, that if you wish to ask the ambassador a question, you say who you are and what your institutional affiliation with, and please stay seated and the microphone will come to you. So now the floor is open. And I'll take a batch of maybe 5 or 6 questions and then give the ambassador the opportunity to answer them.
The advantage of asking 5 at one time, you can ignore the one you don't like.
I hope you won't do that.
I won't.
Daljit Singh.
Ambassador Eikenberry, would you be able to comment on the degree of support, of lack of support for your post-2014 plans for Afghanistan from Russia, China, and Pakistan?
Mr. Singh is from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. Yeah. Sir, halfway back.
So, Ambassador, Ian Chong from the National University of Singapore. I'm curious, as to, you talk about the resource constraints that the US and ISAF would face. So I'm curious what kinds of resources would success in Afghanistan entail, and how does the US and ISAF intend to get them, given the economic problems in both the United States and in Europe? And you also talk very, very vaguely about the major powers in the region. So could you talk about how India, how China, how Iran would fit into the US strategy in addition to Russia? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Baldwin-Jones with the Canadian High Commission and formerly in Kabul as well with the Canadian Embassy. If I might indulge in a slightly less strategic question, and that's, you've been in such a unique position, having had leadership roles on the ground in both the military and the civilian capacities in Afghanistan. And I'm wondering about some lessons learned from that experience in terms of the Powell-Mill interface, and are we working together better, and are there any lessons learned that we should be taking forward?
I'm sorry, the lessons learned with regard to?
The Powell-Mill interface on the ground and how we work together.
Great, okay.
Thank you. Halfway back on the left, thank you.
Thank you, good afternoon. I'm Daniel Magnowski from Reuters News Agency. I know we've touched on Pakistan a little. I just, in the light of Defence Secretary Panetta's comments very recently, that the United States was reaching the end of its patience with Pakistan with respect to safe havens for militants working in Afghanistan. How do you see the next steps of the US-Pakistan relationship?
Thank you very much. And I think one more question in this round, just towards the back there.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Eikenberry, for your wonderfully clear and lucid talk, from which I gained an enormous amount of information. I'm speaking from a very humble and lowly position myself. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. And I have served as a junior officer in the army and in the police, and as a junior member of the academic fraternity in this area. The question I have, which has always filled my interest, is the position of opium in Afghanistan. And I thought one of the main problems there, from earliest times, that is, the British, Russian, and subsequent operations in that area, was how to deal with the problem that was faced and affected the whole world, in fact, of opium production in Afghanistan, and what steps were being made to replace it or deal with it. Thank you very much.
So, Dr. Leon Comber from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies.
Great. Okay. So take it at this point.
So a batch of 5 questions for you, Ambassador.
Yeah, I'll first come back and you had said the lowly position of a research fellow. I'm after leaving government service, I'm now a fellow at Stanford University. I think it's actually an exalted position that we're in as fellows here. Well, let's start. There's some overlap here. First of all, what will be the region and the region's reaction to adjustments that will be made with this transition, and specifically with an enduring U.S. military and likely a NATO military presence in Afghanistan after 2014. Again, we don't know exactly what that presence will, how it will be constituted. There's not an agreement with the government of Afghanistan. Importantly, there has to be a legal agreement with the government of Afghanistan to give legal jurisdiction then to the status of U.S. forces and NATO international forces that are in the country, and those will certainly be difficult negotiations ahead. Let's assume that they're resolved satisfactorily. I would say after 2014 that it's possible U.S. military presence in Afghanistan might be on the nature of perhaps 10,000, 12,000, several thousand non-U.S. NATO forces as well with the security assistance mission. how will Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan, India, how will they react to that longer-term presence? Well, first of all, I know that President Karzai, his Minister of Foreign Affairs, and his national security team have been extraordinarily active. And they've been in Moscow, they've been in Beijing, they've been in Tehran, they've been in Islamabad, New Delhi, and they've talked about this presence. Ultimately, what the Afghan government will say, it's for them to decide, the Afghan government, to decide what should this presence consist of, what should the security relationship with the United States and NATO be. It's not for others to decide for them. That said, I do think that if we look at the sets of common interests that exist among almost all of the powers in the region that have equities in Afghanistan, especially when it comes to the fight against international terrorism, the desire not to see Afghanistan revert to the way it looked on the 10th of September of 2001, which was then a terrorist-controlled state, that with the concerns that exist with Russia and China and with Iran and with Pakistan about narco-trafficking, that there's a strong desire then, I think, to see the transition that the United States and NATO have planned with Afghanistan right now to play this out over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think an appreciation by most of the regional powers that the United States and NATO's presence in Afghanistan beyond 2014 will help to further strengthen the Afghan National Army and the police forces so that they eventually will be able to then take full control and sustain those large police and army forces that are there in the country. So I'd say that looking ahead, that a transition plan that would call for the United States and NATO to have a limited force in Afghanistan beyond 2014, I would think is one that would be supported by Russia and China. Of course, there's tensions with Iran, with the United States. They will probably have a different view. And with regard to Pakistan, I don't think that Islamabad would also like to see a precipitous withdrawal of US and NATO forces, knowing the consequences to Afghanistan's security. What will success in Afghanistan look like? Afghanistan, as we go towards 2014 and beyond, there are going to be challenges, as I had outlined during my remarks. Almost certainly, they're going to have an economic downturn, and this will have security consequences within the country. I don't believe that Afghanistan, though, is at risk of returning to the civil war of the 1990s. I believe that the Afghans, for the reason I had outlined, in terms of the memories of those times of trouble being clear to them, not really having any group of Afghans that desire to split away parts of the country from the center. And I think that the Afghans now, with 10 years behind them of having the establishment of political institutions and a framework for resolution of their difficulties through political versus military and violent means, I would expect that we could have an Afghanistan then beyond 2014 that experiences difficulties, has problems of insecurity in parts of the country, has economic setbacks, but in the main, I think we'll move forward and hold together. There's a question about the lessons learned on the political military front and cooperation between diplomats and development agencies in Afghanistan and the military. I think that if we can look back over the last 11 years of experience of the United States and NATO ISAF and the international military forces with the civilian side, that there's been good progress that's been made in terms of cooperation and collaboration. Certainly on the United States side, there's been, I think, some effective innovations that have taken place over the last 5 years. There's been much more unity that's been achieved in our civilian, in our military efforts in terms of how we've organized and how we've attempted to collaborate. I think that the biggest problem that we've had, though, in terms of civil-military cooperation is not in terms of that we haven't gotten the organizations necessarily right, or we didn't get the right people on the ground to cooperate. It's just that our level of ambition that we had, both militarily and in terms of diplomacy and development, were extraordinarily ambitious. We were reaching and aiming very high. And said, we've had a good degree of success. Take a look at the area of education. In education, in the year 2001, under Taliban rule, there were less than 1 million Afghan children in school. Today, there's 7 million Afghan children in school. In the year 2001, by the way, of those 1 million who were in school, almost all were boys. Now, in the 7 million who are in school, about 40% of those are girls. So if you look at Afghanistan 2001, if you look at Afghanistan in 2012, there's been some real impressive gains that have been made. And those gains have been made through collaboration and cooperation between the military and the civilian sides, and most importantly, in partnership with the Afghan people and the Afghan government. But there's been tensions, of course, as we've raced hard to try to achieve some of these very ambitious goals. Question about opium production and counter-narcotics. You know, this is a very severe problem in Afghanistan. It's estimated that some 90% of the world's non-pharmaceutical opiates come from Afghanistan, 90%. It's estimated that if you take Afghanistan's legitimate gross domestic product and put that against narco-trafficking and the gains that occur in Afghanistan from narco-trafficking, about 40% of Afghanistan's legitimate GDP, against that 100%, about 40% is narco-trafficking money in the country. There's been various estimates of that. That's a high that's been on the low side. It's been about 25%. What we've seen in Afghanistan in the fight against narco-trafficking, wherever the government of Afghanistan has been able to assert positive control in the country and has been able to provide security in those areas, then poppy production of opiates has been reduced significantly. But the government of Afghanistan doesn't have positive control in large parts of the country, and especially in southern Afghanistan. So there's been a very comprehensive approach that the government of Afghanistan, supported by the international community, has undertaken over the last 10 years. It's a full spectrum approach. There's been hard work that's been done to develop Afghan interdiction forces. There's been a fairly successful effort to build a compartmentalized judicial system in which narco-traffickers at the mid-level and the senior levels, when arrested, are put into a compartmentalized system. And there's actually been a very impressive conviction rate over the last several years of mid-level traffickers, including government officials and police. There's been a lot of work that's been put in to efforts to develop alternative livelihoods for the Afghan farmers. So it's not through want of resources, and it's certainly not through want of broad efforts that we're still faced with a very significant narco-trafficking problem in Afghanistan. I think this past year has been a bit of a disappointing year, that we had steady years of the reduction of opium production in the country, and I think it's spiked back up again this year. It's going to be one that is going to require a steady, very patient approach by the international community and the Afghans. If we look at where there's been relative successes globally, whether it be Thailand, Colombia, these are problems that were only cured after several decades of intensive work. And then at the end of the day, There's still a problem that all of us have to recognize when we talk about Afghanistan's narco trafficking. And I said that Afghanistan produces about 90% of the non-pharmaceutical opiates in the world today, but it consumes far less than 1%. So there is a problem here of demand that has to be addressed.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for 2 more questions, and I'm going to ask one of those questions. There was a gentleman at the back who I didn't have the chance to point to earlier. Would you like to ask your question, sir?
Ambassador, I'd like to ask you about...
sorry, could you say who you are?
I'm Alan Chung from the Rajaratnam School. I'd like to ask you about US policy concerning the use of drones in Afghanistan, given that you've given this promise that America would like to withdraw its military footprint. How will the use of drones substitute for policing on the ground and other types of ongoing counterinsurgency in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Alan. And I'll ask my question, if that's all right,
Sure.
as well. I'm afraid this is rather a big question, not an easy one to answer, but I'd welcome some hints at an answer at least. In terms of the big picture, what do you think the implications for US policy and US strategy more widely are of the whole Afghan experience, the intervention and the conflict that the US and NATO have been involved in the last decade?
Right, so these will be the last two.
The last
then.
2 questions,
Okay.
yeah.
First of all, on drones, there's a limit to what the U.S. talks about with the use of drones. Drones have played a very important role if we're talking about just Afghanistan and Pakistan from the very early days of our intervention. And believe me, even with the 100,000 U.S. troops on the ground, which we had last year, the terrain of Afghanistan, the terrain of Pakistan, the difficulties of the border regions, the impossibility of gaining access into certain places of Pakistan where Al-Qaeda does have a presence, where the Haqqani clan has a presence, and they use that presence to plan for operations well outside of Pakistan, or the Haqqani clan has that sanctuary that they enjoy inside of Pakistan, where they conduct operations against US, NATO, and Afghan forces and civilians. In that kind of environment, drones are absolutely essential. They're essential for reconnaissance, and they're absolutely essential for strike as well. So they play a very important role right now in our operations in Afghanistan and other parts of the world, and the reduction of US forces in Afghanistan will not change that. It may play a relatively more important role, but it already plays a vital role. Tim, talking about what does the U.S. then learn from the Afghanistan intervention? I might expand that to include Iraq. 3 points. Number one is, if we talk about an intervention of the level and scope of what we've had in Afghanistan or Iraq, 2 very different kinds of interventions, of course, in terms of legality, sanctioning, but it's critical that political leaders clarify up front what are the political goals that are trying to be achieved here. Without that, then you have great confusion by your military forces, you have great confusion by your political military teams, your civilian military teams on the ground. Here, I do believe that when President Obama took office and did the review of the situation in Afghanistan, what we ended up with by the end of 2009, for the first time, we had clarity about what are the political goals. And I talked about those a moment ago. Those are transition. They're not easy to achieve, but there's clarity. The second would be in terms of the use of military force. And for the United States of America, I think we will be going into a period of time now where there'll be more introspection and the use of military force around the world. You know, there's a story I like to tell, and it's a story that maybe some of you have heard before. It's a story of a knight who's very loyal to his king, and he's been out campaigning all day long. And he comes back very proudly to the castle at the end of a day of campaigning and stands in front of the king and says, "Sire, I've been out all day in the West, defeating your enemies and burning the villages." And the king looks at the knight and says, "But Sir Knight, I have no enemies in the West." And the knight looks at the king and says, with embarrassment, "But sire, you do now." And so the use of force by the United States of America, it comes with second and third order consequences. And this is something that I think, as we recall now, as we look back in the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan, that when we go in with great intentions, then you have to think about the second and third order consequences. And the longer that you remain, then the more the second and third order consequences become problems that you couldn't have anticipated when you first went in. The third and final point would be for the United States, and this is on a personal note, as I look at our presence and I look at our time and our experiences in Afghanistan, I'll tell one more story here then. And that is, as the ambassador, I flew down in 2009 to Helmand Province. Helmand Province is in southern Afghanistan, and that's the center of the narco trafficking industry. When I flew down, as I got off the got off the helicopter in Helmand, I was greeted by a very dynamic Marine Lieutenant Colonel and my State Department team and my USAID team on the ground, and they gave me some great briefings about what was going on. The U.S. Marines had lost a considerable number of their ranks over the last several months as they pushed the Taliban out of this district and then restored security. I met with, after the briefings, some Afghan tribal leaders from that district. And they took me around the village and they walked with me through some of the irrigation canals that are found in that particular district. And I had a Marine security detachment with me. I had my State Department team, my development team, and off we went with these Pashtun tribal leaders. And with a very good interpreter with me, one of the Pashtun tribal leaders said, "Ambassador, do you know what these irrigation canals are here?" And I knew, but trying to be a good diplomat, I said, "No, tell me about them." And so this Pashtun tribal leader, with his very colorful turban on, he said, "Ambassador, this goes back to the 1950s when USAID, that's the U.S. Development Agency, was here and built the powerful Kajaki Dam in northern Helmand, and then this remarkable irrigation canal system that helped transform this province into a breadbasket." So on we went, and he said, "By the way, Ambassador, do you know where Roger is?" And I had to go through the interpreter and said, "Roger?" And Roger turned out to be a USAID engineer of the 1950s who was a very young engineer, befriended this tribal elder when he was a very young man. And so this tribal elder was saying, "Do you know where Roger is?" He must have expected I was from Roger's tribe, and I'd know who Roger was. And I said, "Well, tribal elder, I'm sorry, I don't know, but I'll check." And he said, "Boy, Roger was he was a great person here. He was very popular in this village." We walked on a little bit further, and then another tribal elder said, "Ambassador, do you know where Bob is?" True story. And I said, "Bob?" He said, "Ambassador, Bob, he was here in the 1960s as a young man at that time, and he was a Peace Corps volunteer after President Kennedy had set up the Peace Corps. He taught us English, and we remember Bob used to walk around in tennis shoes and blue jeans. He lived here in the village, and we really remember Bob." The story goes on and on, all during the day, then walking around this community, hearing stories about the United States of the 1950s and 60s. I got on the airplane that evening then, Jim, to fly back to Kabul. And usually as a soldier and ambassador, I would get on a helicopter or a plane, and within 30 seconds, I'd be sleeping. That's where I'd catch up on sleep. But this time on the flight back to Kabul, I was having great difficulty sleeping. I couldn't sleep. And I was wondering what was wrong. And what was wrong was this, is that I reflected back on that day, and what I knew was that those brave Marines who had fought so hard and lost so many of their numbers to secure that Pashtun village, they would not be remembered by the Afghan people. Sadly, they would not be remembered. Who would be remembered was Roger from USAID, and Bob from the United States Peace Corps. So the final point I would make is then, I know there's that expression of Joe Nye's about soft power and hard power. And what I walk away with for the experience of Afghanistan and a long military career is that what made the United States great was the Bobs and the Rogers, the USAIDs and the Peace Corps. What has made also the United States great is a military that can hold the line and defend the gains that the Rogers and the Bobs make. But that's an important lesson, I think, for the United States of America going forward.
Thank you. Ambassador, regrettably, I need to draw this session to a close. It's approaching, or just after 1 p.m. But first of all, thank you very much for your answer to that last question, which I think is a brilliant answer. Before closing the session, I would like to thank you very much for sharing with this very substantial audience this afternoon your thoughts on the future of US policy towards Afghanistan and the broader region. What happens in South and Southwest Asia is going to be important not just for the people of Afghanistan and that sub-region, but also for people and countries across Asia, not least in this part of the world. And you mentioned towards the end of your lecture the presence of Singapore Armed Forces troops in Afghanistan, and well, that's why they're there, because what happens there matters in this part of the world as well. So thank you for your excellent lecture and your full and very frank answers to the good questions that we've had from our audience today. We hugely appreciate your willingness to speak in this third IISS-Fullerton lecture, and I'd like us to show our appreciation in the customary manner. Thank you very much.